Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss the Generation Interconnection Supercluster Interconnection procedures. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by our presenter for today, Steve Ruddy, Director of Grid Assets. And then we also have Neil Miller, Vice President, Infrastructure and Operations Planning, Bob Emmert, Senior Manager, Interconnection Resources, Jeff Billington, Director, Transmission Infrastructure Planning, Robert Sparks, Senior Manager of Regional Transmission South, and Vinay Shrestha, Manager of Regional Transmission North. We have Deb Levine, Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management, Bill Weaver, our Senior Counsel, Sangjae Zhu, Senior Advisor, Regional Transmission Engineer, and Lindsay Thomas from Regional Transmission as well. The presentation, along with the paper that we'll be discussing today, has been posted to the Miscellaneous Stakeholder Meetings webpage on the California ISO website. This call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will be taking both chat questions and verbal questions today. To enter your question into the chat, it's located down on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. We just ask that you please provide your organization when asking your question and that you address it to all panelists. And I'll read out any of the questions that come in through there to our panelists. To enter the verbal phone queue, you can do so by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Again, just a reminder to please introduce yourself and state your organization and name. These calls are structured to stimulate an open dialogue and engage different perspectives with the expectation that stakeholders have read the meeting material. And while we always welcome comments and feedback, just a reminder to please keep them professional and respectful. And then just so we can efficiently manage the time and get through all the material and address as many questions as possible today, please just refrain from repeating or reiterating what has already been said. I'm going to go through the agenda here. We'll start off with the schedule for the stakeholder process, and then provide a bit of background, and then dive deeper into the proposal, and then go over some next steps. So here's our schedule. We are taking comments by May 28th, which is a week from today. We have a comments template available to you out on the Miscellaneous Stakeholder Meeting webpage as well. And then we are planning on putting out a final proposal and draft tariff language mid-June, and then we'll hold another stakeholder call and accept comments before going to, or potentially going to, the ISO Board of Governors meeting in July. And just please note that the June dates are tentative and subject to change. So with that, I will hand it over to Steve, and we'll get started with some background.
All right. Thank you, Isabella, for all your work and support setting up this call today. Also, I'd like to thank everyone on the call for taking time out of your Friday to join and discuss this critical initiative. Excuse me. So I was looking at the attendees list as everyone was signing in, and I see a lot of familiar names who have helped shape the ISO's interconnection procedures over the past. It almost feels like we're getting the band back together. So for those that haven't been along for the ride, here's a little history. Back in 2008, we ran the Generation Interconnection Process Reform, or GIPR, which created the Cluster 2 study approach. It provided cost certainty for interconnection customers, and it also required interconnection customers to post financial security. In 2010, we merged the SGIP and LGIP into one process. In 2012, we ran the Generation Interconnection Deliverability Allocation process, or the GIDAP, to more formalize the deliverability allocation. And since then, we have continued to improve the generation interconnection procedures through the IPE, the Interconnection Process Enhancement Initiatives, which take place every year or two. In fact, we anticipate that we will be kicking off another IPE later this year to discuss more global topics, but only after we complete and hear back from FERC on this more current narrow initiative. So that brings us to the current initiative. Over the previous 9 clusters, we have received an average of about 113 interconnection requests per year. This year, we received 373 requests, totaling over 110,000 megawatts of requested capacity at the point of interconnection. This also equates to 150,000 megawatts of combined generation capacity behind the point of interconnection. For example, a solar battery facility would be an example where the combined generation capacity exceeds the requested interconnection capacity. Now, adding this is what we're referring to as a supercluster to the existing pre-cluster 14 active queue projects, it brings the total in the queue today to over 178,000 megawatts of requested interconnection capacity, or 246,000 of combined proposed generation capacity. To compare this, the ISO's historical peak is 50,116 megawatts back in 2017. As the paper noted, even with a robust procurement in the future, the potential generation available to off-takers exceeds the demand by a significant margin. Now, for the ISO and the participating transmission owners to provide meaningful study results for this many projects and the associated capacity amount under our current tariff framework, it became apparent that we need to expand the study timelines and alter the study process. Next slide, please. Excuse me just for a second here. Too many things open on my screen. All right. So the ISO is proposing 3 principal revisions to its Q cluster interconnection process. These revisions will apply not only to the cluster 14 supercluster, but also any future clusters that have 150 interconnection requests or more. As noted in the paper, 150 interconnection requests was chosen based on our experience with cluster 13, which had 155 requests and required the ISO to extend the timeline to publish interconnection study results. So the first principal revision is the overall study process will be extended by approximately 1 year. The ISO and the PTOs looked at a number of alternatives to see if this timeline could be shortened. We looked at adding more resources. Adding more resources by the PTO and the ISOs beyond the increases already made have not been found to be plausible due to the specific skill sets and experience required. The skilled staff is largely under contract with other parties. You can imagine that with 373 applications. We looked at limiting cluster 14 projects. Could we winnow down what cluster 14 looks like? But applying a harsher application criteria now to cluster 14 projects to reduce the volume does not appear to be feasible either. The 1-year extension still requires study modifications. The ISO and the PTOs evaluated their ability to maintain all current study procedures, but doing so would require us to increase by the timeline by 2 years or more. The ISO does not believe it is reasonable to postpone the studies by that or delay cluster 15 by more than 1 year. Therefore, as covered in more detail in the paper, the ISO proposes to modify how the ISO and the PTOs conduct the phase 1 studies, yet provide meaningful study results. A few of these modifications include establishing reasonable study scenarios and dispatch assumptions for steady-state thermal and voltage analysis. Total generation inside a study area will be limited to produce meaningful study results. The stability assessment will not be performed in the phase 1 since the system conditions and generation dispatch are not expected to produce any system-level stability issues that drive reliability network upgrades. Also, the short-circuit duty methodology will be modified, limiting total online capacity in the evaluation to produce meaningful study results. Regardless of these changes, the phase 1 studies will still identify direct interconnection facilities and network upgrades necessary to interconnect the generating facility, mitigate thermal overloads and voltage violations, and address short circuit and reliability issues associated with the requested interconnection service. The Phase 1 studies will also identify the cost and the cost allocations for all required reliability network upgrades and deliverability network upgrades for customers requesting deliverability. Now, the second principal revision is that the estimated costs and cost allocations provided in the Phase 1 studies will be advisory, and the Phase 2 studies will set the cost caps. This is because the proposed supercluster Phase 1 interconnection study results rely on a different study process than in a typical year. The ISO proposes that the Phase 1 results do not impact the ultimate maximum cost responsibility. Instead, the Phase 2 study will set the maximum cost responsibility. The Phase 1 studies will still provide a current cost responsibility used to establish the interconnection financial security posting requirements, which is a critical milestone to ensure only viable projects continue in the queue. Now, this leads to the third principal revision, and that is interconnection customers will be eligible for a 100% refund of their initial financial security if the Phase 2 studies either increase the maximum cost responsibility by 25% or more than identified in the Phase 1 study, or extends the longest duration reliability network upgrade by 1 year or more than identified in the Phase 1 study. All other interconnection procedures will remain in effect for the supercluster. Next slide, please. All right, this table shows the ISO's proposed deadlines for the Cluster 4 supercluster as compared, for the Cluster 14 supercluster as compared to the current typical cluster deadline. As you can see, the overall schedule is increased by approximately 1 year. For example, the Phase 2 study results would be published in November of 2023 as compared to a typical cluster would be next November 2022. Also note that the Cluster 15 request window would open in April of 2023, delayed by 1 year. As far as interrelated timelines, such as scoping meetings, results meetings, customer response timelines, these deadlines will also be extended. As noted in the paper, the proposed supercluster deadlines will be firm. However, the ISO may publish study results to the whole cluster earlier if available. Now, this brings us to an important point and one the ISO is seeking specific stakeholder feedback on. The ISO plans to publish the study results simultaneously for the whole cluster as it generally does under the normal process. While it could be very possible to publish study results for one PTO earlier than another, the ISO is concerned that this may provide an unfair advantage in an RFO process for power purchase agreements. We would like to hear if stakeholders are in agreement with this premise or have an alternate viewpoint. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the ISO would appreciate any comments stakeholders have on the issue paper and the ISO's proposal. In addition, if any stakeholder has an alternative proposal other than the one presented here, we would appreciate to hear that as well. The comments are due by the end of the day on May 28th, and assuming that this approach is taken, we plan to present this to the board in July. Thank you for listening to me on this, and we have a number of subject matter experts waiting to answer all of your questions, and I believe Neil Miller would also like to make a quick statement.
Oh, thanks, Steve. Yeah, it's Neil here. I'll just jump in for a minute. I just wanted to, well, first, thank everyone for participating in the call. Wanted to acknowledge the unusual circumstances that are leading to me to consider this and these approaches. And I also strongly wanted people to be encouraged to take Steve's request here to heart, that if there are other ideas, we would really be open to hearing those ideas, and we look forward to those showing up in comments. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions, and thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Isabel, do we have any questions in the chat before we open to callers?
I see one. Before I read that out, I'll just give a reminder to those who are going to submit comments through the chat or questions. Please be sure to state your organization. And then to enter the verbal phone queue, you can do so by pressing #2. So I'm going to read out the chat question here first. So doesn't announcing that future clusters hitting a particular threshold will cause a similar supercluster process give more incentive to interconnection customers to submit more speculative projects out of fear of missing out on new projects for the following 2 years instead of 1 year, thereby making it more likely Kaiso will end up with superclusters every cluster? And does Kaiso plan to continue investigating ways to potentially reduce timelines in the event superclusters occur in the future?
Well, I'll go ahead and give the first shot answer on this one, and then maybe Bill would like to chime in. We do not want to have to run to FERC every time we receive a supercluster, and we felt it very appropriate and important to set the bar here at 150 clusters to give the ISO the flexibility to use it. It doesn't mean we're going to use it. It just gives us the flexibility to use a supercluster timeline. I also want to state that, we do plan on having another IPE to hopefully address the larger issue at hand here is why are we getting so many requests, and maybe how to handle those better on a more global stage instead of just in this quick initiative here to get cluster 14 moving forward. Bill, do you have anything to add on that one?
Just a little. I mean, I think first of all, it's it's a very good question, and it's certainly something we need to think about. I think, as Steve mentioned, there are other things we could do separately in the interconnection process enhancements initiative before the next window to try to reduce the number of speculative requests. Like, for example, and I'm not saying we're going to propose this, but the other ISO RTOs don't allow for site exclusivity deposits. You actually have to have a site. Frequently, we have these, projects that just submit a deposit and don't really have a site in mind. They kind of just, playing plug and go with points of interconnection in their scoping meetings. That's low-hanging fruit, for example. But, it's certainly something we need to consider and plan to. Otherwise, the question is correct, but ultimately there's, it's not a problem if there's not a solution, and we have to address, the supercluster before us now.
Okay. We have another question in the chat from Volta. Are the ISP and fast track interconnection procedures also affected by this cluster 14 supercluster?
I guess I'm still unmuted, so I can answer. But the independent study process is unaffected. That's still an option, during this entire supercluster for independent study projects to, to submit, so long as they pass the independent screens, they could be studied independently pursuant to the existing procedures for independent study. I don't know if Bob or Steve wants to take fast track.
Well, this is Bob. Fast track, that will not be affected. It's a pretty straightforward process, and it's not reliant on any particular existing cluster study as a basis for doing the study for that project. But for the ISP does require a particular most recent cluster study to utilize to determine the independence. And now that cluster 14 window is closed, we do need to wait for the cluster 14 phase 1 studies to be able to do that independence test. So while an ISP can submit an interconnection request at any time, they would have to wait until the cluster 14 phase 1 results come out to be able to do their independence test.
Bob.
Do we have any questions over the phone line?
Yes, we do.
Okay,
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I guess I could be part of the member of the band here. I have several questions, but I wanted to start with the last discussion about the independent study process. It seems like in addition to the independent study itself, that these projects would still be affected if they want to go for deliverability, which many of them do. So they would still have to wait if they're not already, in line. They would have to wait until cluster 15 to get their deliverability if they were to submit an application today, and then they wait till after the phase 1 study is done, then they pass the independence test. They still have to wait for cluster 15 to get any kind of RA deliverability, right?
Yeah, very good point, Susan. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Susan, could I address that too?
Sure.
I would say though that they're assuming our summer 2021 enhancements are approved, which are currently pending before FERC. A completed ISP could have an opportunity for that temporary interim deliverability before the next cluster deliverability study. But otherwise, what you guys said is correct.
Okay. No, thank you. That's a really good point. Okay. So other questions. I think your issue with whether whether it gives any PTO or if there's any competitive advantage to some projects in some PTO areas getting their studies before the others. First of all, I'm assuming that they would still all have to wait for the single TPD allocation for the whole cluster to know if they've gotten an allocation. Is that right? You wouldn't if they got their studies earlier, you wouldn't do a TPD allocation for them and then do another one later for, say, the PG&E or whatever studies come second, right? Is that question clear?
Yeah, it's clear. I think you're correct. Sanjay, did you have a different viewpoint on that?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's correct. We are still going to follow the same timeline for TPD allocation.
Okay. And then I think it would be really helpful if the off-takers could put in an opinion about this phase 1 study, particularly the phase 1 study coming at different times, because often for RFOs, the requirement to enter the RFO is a phase 1 study or equivalent. And so the question is, obviously some people get to phase 1 studies before others. That might give them a competitive advantage. But if this is going to be sort of a truncated phase 1 study and not as definitive as the usual phase 1 study, so if the off-takers would accept that, or if they would accept that, then it might have more of a competitive effect than if they were not going to accept that because it was less detailed and less binding than normal and might wait till phase 2. So it would be good to hear from the off-takers about what they think, how they would regard this kind of a phase 1 study. So that wasn't too necessarily directed at you guys. But I do have a couple of other questions here. It looks like you did actually look at more stringent conditions. So you actually did take a look at the idea of taking projects that might be more ready or maybe using existing gen ties or that kind of thing. And can you say why you didn't feel that was viable?
Well, this is Bill. From a legal perspective, we do run up against the filed rate doctrine. There are certain changes we can make to study processes while interconnection customers are in queue, but sort of changing anything but the timelines, which we kind of already have Tariff authority to change. I'm not certain that FERC would look at it as anything but kind of retroactive rate making. I think to actually change the conditions on which to even be studied, we would have had to come in before.
Okay, because I think when the cluster study process was first implemented, there were some projects in the transition cluster. There was a question of whether some projects would be able to continue with the serial study process versus being shoved into a cluster study in the transition cluster when that's not how they applied. There were some, I don't remember exactly, they had to put down more money. I don't remember exactly what the conditions were, but there were some changes made after they had already submitted their applications. And I think if they hadn't gotten their feasibility study yet or their system impact study, I don't remember what it was. But anyway, it might be helpful to go back and take a look at that if that was something you might otherwise think about doing.
And Susan, it's Neil here. It's Susan?
Yeah.
It's Neil here. I'd just like to jump in on that if people have ideas on things they think we should look at there, we'd really encourage people to submit those ideas in comments.
Okay. That's fair.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. And then another question I have is when you looked at resources that were available, I understand what you're saying about everybody being conflicted because there's there's a limited amount of resources and people to do this kind of thing. Did you look into? I mean, I actually got a phone call from someone who was retired saying, "Well, do you think they'd be interested?" Have you looked into people who have maybe recently retired or might be interested in a limited engagement, say for 18 months, to do something like this?
Only if they reached out to us. We have discussed this with some, but not the volume of resources that we're going to need to run not only the management of the process, the interconnection specialists, but all the engineers that it would take to get them ramped up into the current scenario. Just did not seem feasible.
Okay.
But we did. Looks like we are going to grab a couple retired folks back. We already did one.
Okay. Okay, good. I have, when you talk about the scenarios you're going to do with a lower volume, are you thinking more like, I was trying to think about how that would work, but are you thinking that you would just take the projects that applied and maybe do a pro rata reduction to the volumes or the capacities they applied to, so that you still get all the project locations in for these studies? Or are you looking at taking some projects and just removing them completely? Or can you kind of share what you're thinking about with how to do that?
Robert Sparks, you want to take this one?
So we have put together some procedures internally and regarding limiting the generation, dispatch, and the power flow studies, and so we are looking at trying to produce more reasonable results like we talked about. We're still working on the details and still working with the transmission owners to ensure what we have planned is completely feasible, especially on the short circuit assumptions. But we're certainly not going to just stick everything in the cluster 14 and earlier clusters into the models and produce ridiculous results.
And nobody wants you to do that. Are you going to, it would be helpful if you have something that you could share, so as part of this comment process, people might be able to offer you suggestions or at least think about what you're doing in terms of phasing, forming the rest of their comments. If there's any way to do that within, sometime reasonable amount of time before the 28th is a week, but if there's anything you can share that could get into the comment process in some fashion, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I don't know that we're prepared to do that right now, but certainly any ideas that stakeholders have could be submitted in writing, and we would like to see those comments.
Okay. Let's say that can't be done before you go to the board. I guess my question is, would it be possible to work that in somewhere in this process so that people could give you that feedback? I mean, they may have ideas, but they haven't seen anything yet. So once they see something, is there any way to kind of get the opportunity to examine that and make suggestions into the process? After they see something?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah. It'd be helpful if people could see something now. Of course, what they could do is think about what you're planning to do, and offer you comments on that now, and or in deciding, on the rest of their comments, take into account which way you seem to be going. But if that's not possible, then even after you go to the board, or maybe even shortly before that, but sometime around then, if before you actually start these studies, if there's a way to share that information and that people have an opportunity to give you comments and suggestions and feedback somewhere in this process before you actually start doing it, might that be possible to do?
Yeah, no, I understand your comment. Go ahead.
I was just saying our goal is to be as transparent as possible. So as we identify what we're going to do, I think we will be making that as open and transparent as we can.
Okay, and also potentially with the feedback opportunity. That's one of my questions. I mean, I guess everyone should want to know what you're doing, but if there's any way to do that, you might actually appreciate some suggestions you might get from people before that decision is finalized.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, and then the last question I had.
You could put that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Hold on. You could put that comment so that we can capture that one too as well. I appreciate it.
Okay, sure, we'll do. And then my last question is: I assume that are you anticipating a tariff filing, or do you think that the Kaiso can change timing and things like that just based on the authority it already has?
Bill?
Yeah. So I'll answer that question as well as I think Rebecca Furman's question from Edison, and someone else also asked a tariff waiver question in chat. So yes, we plan to take this to FERC and to implement these, into the tariff to give interconnection customers certainty, transparency, clarity. At this point, the reason why we haven't, just filed a petition for relief, a waiver, is because even though the Kaiso generally always meets its study deadlines, we do have the tariff authority to extend scoping meetings, to extend, the phase one study results through the issue of a market notice. So if we were to come up upon those immediately and we were worried about our ability to comply with the tariff, yes, we would come in and immediately seek a petition for relief to waive those tariff requirements beforehand. At this time, we don't think that's necessary. We're not at risk of a compliance issue. We can just issue a market notice to extend those deadlines. And so following the conclusion of this stakeholder initiative, we want to go immediately to FERC to memorialize these changes. Rebecca's question was a little more nuanced. It was saying, well, if you're worried about filed rate doctrine for this cluster, and I was really only speaking there to kind of raising the actual interconnection request requirements for this cluster. I think, I don't think we have filed rate doctrine concerns with changing the timelines for this cluster, something we have to do regardless. But in any case, Rebecca's question was on, would we need to, could we also file a petition for relief to make requirements a little more stringent as we go along for this cluster? And yeah, that is something that is on the table, but I don't think we're strongly considering at this time. I mean, we need to see how this goes. We need to see how phase one goes. I think as probably everyone knows on this call, most interconnection customers do drop out after phase one when they get their initial results, or they do their first rounds with the RFOs. So we expect, some thinning out, if not a substantial amount, and that could impact how we go from there. But this is what we're thinking about for now, but otherwise everything, is on the table, although no, we don't see a compelling need to file a waiver immediately.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all I've got right this minute, but thanks very much. I'll let somebody else have a chance to ask some questions.
Yeah, and Susan, we never answered your very first question, which, you're definitely in the band.
Thank you so much. I'll have to think about what instrument I'd like to be playing here. Thank you.
I think you're the drummer. We march to your beat.
Well, I only wish that were true, but thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to start reading those out. So first from Justin Rattle at ADF, renewables. One, are there any other options that the Kaiso contemplated that could reduce cluster size? And does the Kaiso foresee any technical modeling issues or limitations?
This is Bill. Hearing silence, I guess I could try to take it. I mean, I don't think there's any. I don't think we're looking to thin the cluster out immediately through any new tariff action. I think we've addressed that. It might be on the table for this cluster in the future, and it might be something we evaluate through the interconnection process enhancements for future clusters as well. In terms of how we model and technical studies, I don't know if anyone from planning wants to take a shot at that.
Yes, Mr. Fongzhu. Yeah, we do say, with such a cluster, supercluster on top of the previous cluster, the technical study, modeling and study will be very difficult. That's why we propose to modify the study approach, where we build a study model on what we consider as reasonable system conditions, and the conditions that include the load condition, import into California ISO, and the generation dispatch. All those factors will be considered when we're building the study model. So basically, there's no way to dispatch all the generation in the queue simultaneously at their maximum output. That there will be significant generation curtailment in the study.
Okay, thank you. We have another one from Hillary Hebert at Con Ed Development. Is Kaiso planning to provide any information up front about the location and volume of interconnection requests relative to estimated deliverability availability to help developers determine whether to stay in the process?
The limitation, like the deliverability availability, right now is available in many the public documents, or such as the transmission plan report, or on the secure website on MPP, all the cluster report and the TPD allocation results. Then also at the scoping meeting for each particular project, we are going to inform them of all the transmission limitations, including deliverability availability.
And it's Neil here. In addition to that, we are looking at if there's some additional way to provide some clarity around the sheer volume located in particular areas on top of that.
And this is Bob. Normally we don't put the latest cluster into the queue report until all the projects are validated. But realizing we're going to be in an extended time frame to do that this year, we are planning to post that kind of information, basically the queue report type of information for all the projects that are still active in the validation process on the same website that this presentation has been posted at.
Thank you all. Okay, our next question from Z Global. Is the deadline to solve all contingencies for the C14 projects will be extended?
I'm guessing by contingencies it means what the validation issues, right? That's got to be it. I guess I can answer since I'm guessing what the question is, but the tariff already gives us the ability to extend those to provide day-per-day extensions to the extent we need additional time. So yeah, I mean it's likely that it'll take slightly longer than usual. So I guess the short answer is yes.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, from PG&E, can the Kaiso elaborate on how the additional study time for phase 1 will provide more meaningful results if there's a reasonable expectation that many of the requests will not move forward into phase 2?
Yeah, but in the phase 1 study, although we expect many of them will not move forward into phase 2, we don't know who will not move into phase 2. So we still need to do a feasible study, assuming each one will move into phase 2. And also the phase 1 study results it actually impacts whether the project wants to move into phase 2 or not. Extending the timeline, the study timeline, so give us extra time to go through the study process to build a reasonable base case, producing meaningful results, and the meaningful results will be the basis for the customer to make a decision for phase 2.
Yeah, and that issue is exacerbated by a supercluster, but certainly not unique to it. That's just a reality of the cluster study process.
Okay, thank you. Now, we have another question from Z Global. We understand that SCE, that WDAT ISP projects will be impacted by the supercluster, but unclear how. Is SCE available on the call to comment on possible impacts?
I mean, I would say, I think we don't want to put SCE on the spot. This isn't their call, but I think Bob hit the nail on the head in that the tariff procedures themselves for in the independent study process are not impacted. However, the timelines might be because they depend on, certain results coming out of the cluster studies.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Moving to the next question from Burns and McDonald. Do you anticipate other changes to the study process or methodology for this supercluster beyond those outlined today that may arise as this study progresses? In other words, do you anticipate more issue papers and stakeholder input as you go through this study?
Yeah, it's quite possible that what we have thought about today won't cover every single challenge we will run into during the study. So we will, if something arises during the study, we will figure out a way to resolve that, but we do not expect to have issue paper and stakeholder input in the middle of a study.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, we don't plan a next iteration, although I guess we would, if we had to, we had to.
Okay, and then the last question I'm seeing in the chat before we move back to the phone line from 8 Minute Solar Energy. How will you be able to accommodate 150,000 megawatts when Kaiso load is only about 50,000 megawatts? Will the results of phase 1 study be meaningful?
No, we are not going to dispatch all that 150 gigawatt in one study. So this will be taken care of by the study approach. As I said, so the study is broken into smaller study areas. Therefore, each study area, when we develop the study model, we'll make sure the model represents a reasonable scenario that includes the generation dispatch. So the generation dispatch will be curtailed in the study.
Okay, thanks, Sanjay. I did see one last one come in, so I'll read that one out from IPA Power. It was mentioned earlier that the Cluster 14 Cube projects under review would be posted with the materials for this meeting. What is the timing for that?
We expect to publish that sometime next week. And as most of you know, that does show the point of interconnection for each project and the megawatts. So you'll be able to determine how many megawatts are interconnecting within areas that is similar to your project.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, so let's move back to the questions on the phone. How many do we have in the queue?
We do have 4 questions left.
Okay, let's start with those.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, as Gary, NSC, Gary Holdsworth. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Gary, we can.
Great. So this is just a clarification on Principle 3, because you discuss it later in the paper, but not in Principle 3 as outlined in the first part. What you're talking about there, a refund of IFS, presupposes withdrawal, correct? Doesn't mention it, but I have to think that only asking for a refund of IFS. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Very good clarification.
Right. And then, secondly, along the lines of secondary impacts of this supercluster, we will, in our comments, our written comments to you, discuss more time required for GIA development and negotiation after the study process is complete. We've had more discussions internally about that, and we think we're going to actually need more time than was originally anticipated. So we'll put that in our comment. Thanks. That's all I had.
Yeah, we did put in the paper, I think we estimated an additional 30 days, but, this is a proposal, and if stakeholders, feel more time on certain issues, if we have to accommodate them, that's what we need to do. Thanks.
Yep.
Caller, your line is unmuted.
Good morning. This is Rayanne Quadro from Gridwell Consulting on behalf of EDF Renewables. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Rayanne.
Great. Thanks, Steve. I appreciated your allusion to the band. It kind of feels to me like a high school reunion that I actually want to go to. I was wondering if, in the interest of sort of just open dialogue, if the Kaiso would expand on other options considered for the MCR and what informed landing where it is. I think that provides a lot of assurance to the PTO, but not as much assurance to interconnection customers who are looking to get an idea of their costs earlier. And I was also wondering, if one of those options had been to, instead of eliminating the MCR with phase 1, capping where the phase 2 MCR could land. Like one example of that being that the phase 2 MCR wouldn't exceed 200% of the phase 1 MCR. And, without being able to see the queue, it's hard for me to know what effects that would have. But I'd just like to hear sort of what the conversation was like about that internally.
Yeah, this is Bill. I think if you want to submit alternative proposals in your comments, we'd be happy to look at them. I mean, we thought of a variety of scenarios, but I think ultimately, having some part of the MCR in phase 1, it raises the stakes so much for the PTOs in performing the phase 1 study, which is already, very, very precarious due to this, huge number of interconnection requests and megawatts, that we're worried that it would just, that the PTOs would need so much time to make sure the phase 1 study is precise. It would really, we'd really have to push the deadlines even more, which we just think is impractical for everyone. I mean, that's the concern we're running up against. It's not just about costs. The costs also have an even greater timing concern.
I appreciate you drawing that connection for me between costs and timing. I don't think that was immediately clear in my thinking, so thank you for that. And then my one other question is if there would be any ways for the Kaiso, if not for this discussion, before the IPE discussion, to gather data about how many folks in the supercluster had site exclusivity upon their interconnection request, understanding exactly what that ratio has looked like for cluster 14 and perhaps for previous clusters would be really important to that discussion.
Yeah, this is Bill. I think we'd have to think about that. I'd be worried about publishing it for a cluster in queue. We do have to protect interconnection customer data. So I think it is something we have to look at, and I think it is, we'd have to publish some sort of data both to make our case to stakeholders and to make our case for FERC, but it's likely that it would probably be aggregated maybe across more clusters.
That seems appropriate.
Short answer is yes, that is something we can do. Just have to think about it.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you. I'll submit the rest of my comments in written form.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. This is Alan Combs. I have a couple of questions. So I think Bob said that there'd be some posting of information on the queue data. I'm wondering if, like, before comments are due next week, that we could see, like, the figure on, I think it's page 6, by PTO. I do think it has bearing because one of the comments you're asking me for is whether you said that other than PG&E, the PTOs could, Edison and San Diego could have the results sooner. So I think it's, I think it'd be useful to know how many applications are out there by PTO.
Yeah, this data will be as close to the data that we show in the standard queue report as possible, so it will show the PTO.
All right. And so more substantively, I mean, can you give a little more color on the how many on the months earlier? I mean, that seems important. Is there actually and again, I know this is a function of how many applications they have, but is there a way to actually put Edison and San Diego on a 6 months ahead or or just on its normal schedule for phase 1? Again, understanding there's maybe some simplified methodology out there as well that you're proposing to use. Does that question make sense?
Bill, are you on?
Could you say the question again? I'm not sure.
Well, I think there was an indication of certain PTOs could have their phase 1 study results done several months earlier. I guess I'd like to, can you be a little more specific?
Yeah, I don't think we can. I think what we said in the paper was several months. So I think as specific as we could be would be, maybe 3 to 6 months earlier at the fastest. I mean, but we're completely speculating here.
Okay. Well, the PTOs are commenting, so let's hope maybe they can even add more information in their comments. A lot of my questions were covered. I'll try not to. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, our concern is unfair advantage by doing that, releasing some PTOs information or studies earlier than others. What we're really asking the stakeholders for is, do you agree with that premise or not? If there is no advantage by releasing the studies earlier, let us know that and why. We feel that it would provide an unfair advantage in an RFO process. So we plan to release them all at the same time.
Yeah, and I would echo what Susan said too, that it would be especially useful to hear from the LSEs themselves to know what they would do with, early study results in some PTO areas, knowing that, another PTO area might be forthcoming in months. We might go try to find that information ourselves.
Understood. I mean, in my view, there's discrimination and there's undue discrimination, and it's the undue discrimination you can't enter into. But if you have a factual or exogenous reason why things need to be different, then you've got a basis for it. So in this case, the amount of requests you have are less. So, so the facts will help, and that's why I asked for that. You've already had several comments about incentives between phase 1 and phase 2. I just want to note that all things in, you're making it easier to stay in to phase 2 because, if anything, there's now a refundability condition. You can drop out if your costs go up. And so is there really, I know you're asking for this in comments, but was it just concerns over filed rate that precluded you from, say, either requiring site control to go into phase 2 or actually maybe increasing the amount of non-refundability of the first IFS, or even, was it really limited? Was it really the concern over file rate, or is there something else? Because otherwise, the way I look at it is, if you really don't know what your results are until phase 2, and there isn't like a mini restudy at the time of the second IFS, I look at the schedule and I don't really know what my results are until the first reassessment after this phase 2 study, and that's now pegged at August 2024. And I do hope to be retired from the band by then. So.
Yeah, those are all good points. And those are the more global questions that we plan to take up in the IPE initiative that will follow this narrow initiative. We are going to look at a lot of different things that will not only affect the supercluster, but cost for other clusters that aren't superclusters to move into phase 2 or to continue on, or their refundability and things like that. But why we landed where we did on the 25% is folks still have to make their postings. It's still at risk. We do not anticipate costs to go up. They could, and we're protecting the PTOs for those drastic changes. But we expect costs to kind of follow like they have in the past. Generally, they go down from phase 1 to phase 2. So if folks want to move into phase 1 thinking they're going to get their money back, that's a big risk. I'm sorry, if they want to move into phase 2 thinking they're going to get their initial security post back, that's a big risk. They need to be certain that they are ready to go forward with those costs. 25% is a significant increase.
Okay. All right. Will there, if there was something considered in the IPE process, could that affect how this supercluster's conditions between phase for first IFS or second IFS are affected, or would the IPE only consider changes post the supercluster?
No, we could consider changes for the supercluster as well.
Okay. All right. That's good. Those were my questions. Thank you.
Don't leave the band.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Madeline Aldridge with Transco Energy. Alan, I don't see you going anywhere anytime soon. But if you do, I'll still be here. So we've got some time on this one. This one's going to be quite an interesting play out, I think. You'll want to stick around. So just a few questions for clarification. Just Cluster 13, will this affect any timing or impact on Cluster 13?
We do not anticipate that at this time.
Okay, good. And then this question of the MCR increasing, or the opportunity to withdraw with a larger refund, I'm assuming that maximum cost response, just for clarification, will include all contingent network upgrades as well. So phase one is likely to be, the costs are likely to be at a maximum anyway. Is that right?
This is Bill. Yeah, that's correct. Maximum cost responsibility, which would include contingent network upgrades. So the short answer is yes.
Okay. Although your posting is on actually contingent network upgrades, I think, are in your cost exposure, right? So your cost responsibility for posting purposes are the current allocated costs to your project, right?
That was a little garbled, but generally yes. Postings based on current cost responsibility, which does not include contingent network upgrades. Maximum cost responsibility would, but doesn't set the postings, but would trigger the refundability if the interconnection customer withdraws.
Okay, but initially it will include, MCR does include the cost of contingent network upgrades.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Bill, no, MCR doesn't include Canyon. MCE includes Canyon.
Can you say it again, Sanjay?
Sandra, can you repeat what you said?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. The conditionally assigned upgrades, Canyon, are not on the maximum cost responsibility. They are on the maximum cost exposure. Canyon, the current process, Canyon cost could go up between phase one and phase two, and the phase two Canyon cost establish the MCE.
Okay, so that's where we could possibly see the cost increasing, is that from phase one, your contingent network upgrades end up rolling into your allocated costs, and therefore you could see that type of increase. And this would allow the project to withdraw without having withdrawing because those costs rolled in, right?
Didn't follow, but the cost MCR, the current process MCR will not increase between phase one and phase five because it's lower between the two. So there's a proposal the phase two MCR could increase because phase one is advisory, and the phase two could identify more upgrades that's not seen in the phase one due to a simplified study approach.
Okay, so that would be the only reason you'd see this number 3 be implicated, is new upgrades would be added. Okay, I just want to make sure that if it is that the contingent network upgrades end up being assigned, that is an option to get out with 100% refund. But you're saying this is a different case. So, okay, thank you. And then just a comment on the, increasing to reduce the size of the cluster. And there was this comment about, maybe adding site control up front. And that's what other ISOs do. I think the other ISOs, though, if you're like referring to MISO, they have extensive mapping available up front that's public. You don't have to have an interconnection request in that talks about congestion in all the different areas and what clusters and projects are in those areas. So there's a lot more available information up front before you have to put in an interconnection application. And I think, you mentioned that the TPD reports, and area reports are available, but they're only available, in my understanding, they're only available if you have an interconnection request in. So if there was an option for more information before you put your interconnection request in, so you don't have to be in RINs yet, that could be made available to developers, I think that can help decrease, or maybe even having informational meetings ahead of time, that could potentially decrease the size of the cluster. Because at this point, you don't really know, you can't get a sense of what's going to happen until you start your study process. And I think, as Alan even pointed out, you really don't know your true results until phase 2, at the end of phase 2, or even a reassessment. But I think, putting more limits on the developers doesn't necessarily help unless there's a lot more information available. So that's just a comment on that. And one last question. What specifically in the methodology is causing the timeline increase? Is it the fact that you're going to have smaller areas to study, or is it the individual studies that's actually causing the delay? And the reason I'm asking is because I'm wondering if there's any area reports that could be produced on time versus all the individual reports.
Yeah, the overall study process is not just technical study, so there are multiple steps. Technical study, the data assessment, reliability assessment, and then there's the estimate of the scope and the time duration, and there's writing the report. So each step will take much longer. And the increase for estimate the cost and duration and writing report is almost linear to the number of projects in the queue. So we have to do that for each individual project. Then the increase in the study time actually is, comparing to the rest of the study process, it's less actually. So the study process, we're going to refine the study approach. So we try to build a reasonable dispatch scenario, and that is, it will be an iterative process. We won't be able to achieve that in one shot. We just know how to build a case. We have to start from high generation dispatch, then we'll apply congestion management to lower the dispatch. Then it will be iterative. So it will take many more iterations than usual to build a reasonable base case for the study purpose. So overall, so all those factors together, we need a lot more time to complete the phase 1 study and also the subsequent phase 2 study.
All right, great. Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate the time it takes to do that and just to set it all up as well. One more question. TPD allocation process, I think you said that will stay on its same schedule. And I'm just wondering, if your phase 1's coming out in September, I don't know if this would make sense or not, but can a phase 1 project that only had a phase 1 result enter into the TPD allocation affidavit process?
No, the TPD is after the phase 2. So for cluster 14 projects, their affidavit is due after they receive the phase 2 report, and the TPD allocation is after that.
So they have to wait until the 2023 year to be able to even request an allocation.
That's right. That's 2023, 2024 reassessment.
Right. All right. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, this is Robert. I just want to jump in real quick on Madeline. I thought you mentioned that the area reports were only available on RIMS. I thought you said that, but I just wanted to add that the area reports, which have a tremendous amount of information, are available on the market participant portal, and any stakeholder has access to the market participant portal, once they go through the process to get access.
Right, and I guess maybe that's a clarification I'd like. I'm used to being in the interconnection process, and I go to the TPP site to get the TPP reports and the area report. So can anyone, if they don't have an interconnection request at this point, they're a developer, they're coming in, can they get access to the NDA process anyway, even without an interconnection request?
I believe they can, but need a lawyer to answer that definitively. But my understanding is potential developers, basically pretty much all market participants can get access to the market participant portal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to know. Go ahead. Is that there?
Okay. So we're going to pause the questions for a moment. I see a few more in the chat have come in, but I think Bob Emmert had some additional information he wanted to share. So Bob, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Isabella. I thought I would just share, excuse me, what we have in Cluster 14 right now, just on a very high-level basis before we publish the information, just so people have somewhat of a feel today. So as of today, or actually yesterday, we had 361 projects that were still in the process of being validated. Some projects we found were not ISO points of interconnection, so they left. And some other projects had some, various things and reasons that they were not, of the 373, a few of those were not complete. So as of today, 361 projects. For PG&E, they have 196 of those. Edison has 111. Grid Alliance has 5. CEA has 4. CTRT has 9. And San Diego Gas and Electric has 42. So that just gives you kind of a general feel of kind of distribution of projects across the PTOs. Thanks, Isabella.
Thanks, Bob. So to go back to the questions in the chat, we have one from IPA Power. In previous studies, the results have been separated out into subregions within each PTO. Given Kaiso's proposal to limit generation within subregions, would Kaiso consider breaking down the studies into electrical subregions and allow these studies to proceed at their own pace?
The studies are always by the study area, at least the reports. But in general, we do publish reports for all the study area at the same time. So that's kind of the same question as we discussed earlier, whether we want, is it fair to have some reports published or released earlier than the others? And we're seeking feedback on that question.
Thanks, Songji. And I'm seeing another, looks like suggestion more than question from IPA. Kaiso should evaluate further reducing the scope of the phase 1 study to thermal issues alone in order to accelerate phase 1 results, so non-ready projects can draw sooner rather than later. Voltage, stability, and short circuit should be performed for phase 2.
Yeah, we are going to perform stability in phase 2 only based on the power flow dispatch assumption we proposed. But for short circuit duty, we still feel that we have to, because the short circuit duty mitigation usually they are not very expensive, but they could take a long time to construct, and that is the important decision point for the customer to decide whether they want to move forward into phase 1 and phase 2. The lack of that information it could that make everybody move into phase 2 and we don't get a smaller phase 2 for a real study. So it has some disadvantage, although it simplifies the phase 1 study.
Thanks, Sanjay. So I'm seeing two more in the chat. One from 8 Minute Solar. Since phase 1 cost estimates are advisory, it indicates those are high-level costs. Why would you need a full year to develop only high-level costs, and what is the purpose of phase 1 study then?
Well, it's called high-level cost, and it really just means that there might be some upgrades not identified in the phase 1 but could show up in phase 2. So for whatever identified, those are real, and we believe those are reasonable estimates of the upgrades expected for the project if they all move forward. So that is still very important information for the interconnection customers.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question I'm seeing from Leeward Energy, is the proposed Kaiso schedule a worst-case scenario, or does the risk exist that schedule could move out even more?
It's going to be tight, but we feel that it can be met, and we do not plan on moving it out anymore.
Okay, I think we have a couple more questions in the phone queue, so we'll move to those.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Susan Schneider again. I apologize. I think it was Steve for asking me to repeat that, but you went through those applications by PTO or by PTO area, and could you just briefly go through those again? Those were pretty fast, and I couldn't quite get all of them.
That was Bob. Bob, you want to do that again?
Oh, Bob, sorry.
Yes. Okay, so total IRs that are still in process are 361. PG&E 196, Edison 111, Grid Alliance 5, CEA 4, CCRT 9, and San Diego Gas and Electric 42.
Okay. All right. And then when you say they're still in validation, does that, you had 377 before, and then this is 361, and if they're still in validation, you're still processing them?
What I'm saying is we actually have some that are valid, some are not. So this is still those that are still active and eligible to be studied in phase 1.
Okay, so they're not still in the validation process. They have either been validated or they're still in the process?
Yeah, that's correct. These are, some of these projects could drop out where they never get validated, but assuming they all get validated, these are the totals that have the potential to be validated and be studied in phase 1.
Okay, so the 377 is what you originally got, and you're seeing the 377 and the 361 is projects that have already failed validation and dropped out. Am I understanding that?
Well, as I was saying earlier, actually it was 373 projects that provided all the materials needed for us to test for completeness. Some of those projects, once we determined some of those were not complete. Some of those projects turned out to be their POI was not ISO controlled, so they were switching over to WDAT. We actually had 5 ISPs. This includes 5 ISPs that failed independence tests and have moved to cluster 14. So it's that combination of projects that are now still working towards being included in phase 1.
Okay, so you had 3, and I apologize, I don't mean to be difficult, but you had 377 to start with, and you have 373 that were complete. And then...
No, 370, excuse me, Susan, 373 are the ones that we actually receive money for. So at that point, once we receive the study deposit, we go into the check for completeness. So of the 373, some of those projects were not complete. I don't have exact numbers at this point.
Okay, so the difference between 373 and 361 is projects that were not complete and projects that really should be in the WDAT. Is that right? Or ISPs? I'm just trying to trace it, connect the dots. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So projects that were not complete, projects that turned out to not be interconnecting to the ISO control grid, and 5 ISPs that were added to cluster 14.
But they failed validation, you said.
They failed independence test.
They failed the independence test. Okay. So you lost some, and then the 5 got added, and the net change was from 373 to go to 361.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the clarification.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead. Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Yep. This is Arash Awatzian from EDF Renewables. First, thank you for this presentation. I just want to make a general comment. I've heard folks talking about, seeing questions about the study process. I just want to, talk a little bit about some of the queue reforms that has happened in Midwest at MISO and SPP and the queue sizes there. I would encourage Kaiso to maybe collaborate with some of those folks. I mean, I hear talking about the queue size and really the recommended suggestions here doesn't seem that it would impact things significantly. The problem is at the start of the queue, and this is just going to get worse and worse as we move forward. So taking a look at some of the work that has been done in the past queue reforms by MISO and SPP today, I think it would be very helpful to be discussed in this forum. Again, just keep in mind that MISO queue size back in 2017, 18, even 19 was 100 plus, and where MISO is today, they're performing their 2021 cycle in 2021. So it just seems like we all need to put our minds together and come up with a more comprehensive solution to address some of these issues. Taking a whole year for coming up with a cost estimate or not eliminating, for example, short circuit studies in phase 1, which is a preliminary stage, might be too much. So we really need to break these things down and have more discussions about that. Thank you.
Yeah, this is the waiver. I mean, I think to the extent stakeholders have, specific proposals, we're happy to borrow or copy and paste. And I agree. I think eliminating short circuit duty is likely extreme, and I mean that's established in FERC Order 2003. I think we would face feedback there, and I don't think we have much of an appetite for that. In general, though, I think it's important to remember, the Kaiso interconnection procedures are generally considered, best in class, and the FERC Order 845 proceeding certainly recognize that. So we're always looking for improvements, certainly. But I think we have established ourselves as a pretty efficient process. This is a anomalous result.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I sympathize with you on this. I mean, this is not a I guess an easy problem. I think everywhere across the country we're facing this, and we're trying to work with the ISOs. However, things are changing, and I think we need to evolve with that. And saying that we have a pretty robust process, I mean, that's exactly what I heard on the PJM calls recently, that we have a pretty robust process. However, it takes 3 to 4 years, even more, and there's a huge backlog. So I think we're seeing it, a shift in the fleet of generation. We're seeing, just a change in system. And I think the processes that were put in place were based on a different environment, and things are changing. So, and we look forward to working with you guys on recommending, suggestions and ideas to help, I guess, move this process forward together. But I appreciate the comment. Thank you.
Okay, perfectly fair. Steve, did you have something?
Yeah, I want to clarify a couple of things. One is we're not eliminating short circuit duty studies. We're just modifying them to limit the capacity so that in various areas so that we can provide meaningful study results. The only thing we're not doing is a stability assessment in the phase 1. We will be doing it in the phase 2. Second, someone earlier commenter said that we are going to provide high-level costs. That's not accurate either. We're going to provide costs under our current methodology. It's just not going to set the cost cap. So the costs are going to be pretty accurate. So I just wanted to clarify those two things. And the third point is that we understand the most recent commenter's concern about things are changing. And we are going to address the bigger issues in the upcoming IPE initiative later this year. But we need to get FERC on board to allow us to move forward with this Cluster 14.
Do we have any other questions on the phone?
We have no further questions at this time.
Okay, I do see one more question in the chat from Kara Miles at W Power. Of the remaining C14 projects, how many do not have site control?
Yeah, this is Bill. I mean, I'm certain we don't have those numbers before of us, but also, I threw site control out at the very beginning of this call merely as an example of something, that could be proposed in among other proposals to make the interconnection request requirements a little more stringent. I don't want, we focused on it a lot on this call, but it was really just an example and just something that even if we did raise, I think we'd only be knocking out, not a high percentage of projects. Ultimately, getting an option to lease that goes through, COD isn't too hard of a requirement. So I don't want everyone to put all their faith or have ire against the projects that don't have site control now. I mean, posting $250,000 is, also is a legitimate requirement under the tariff today.
Thanks, Bill. I'm seeing a question from Ellis Power. What if a large number of Cluster 14 projects drop out after scoping meetings in September? Is there a chance the timing could be accelerated to less than 1 year delay?
I think that is possible. I think what we propose to do is when we establish these supercluster timelines in the tariff is have these established as no later than dates. And to the extent we are able to publish earlier, either on a PTO by PTO basis or for the whole cluster, depending on what stakeholders feel we should do, then certainly we would seek to do so.
Do you have any questions on the phone?
We have no questions at this time.
Okay. Again, to enter the queue, you can do so by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I think I'll give it a minute, see if anybody enters the queue. Do we have anyone on the phone line?
We have no questions at this time.
Okay. Well, then, as a reminder, we will be taking comments and questions on the issue paper and draft final proposal by end of day May 28th, which is next Friday. We have a comments template posted out on the miscellaneous stakeholder meetings webpage available for you to use. And if you could please just submit those comments to initiativecomments@kaiso.com, which is the email listed on this slide, that would be greatly appreciated. And then again, assuming this approach is taken, the ISO intends to present the proposal for approval during the July 14th and 15th Board of Governors meeting. So Steve or anyone else, do you have anything to add before we conclude?
No, I really appreciate the lively discussion, and I thank everybody for joining us. And Isabella, thank you for your help on this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your participation, especially on a Friday. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.